Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and as I said in the last video, I was going to make a video specifically covering the overhaul to the Easterling faction in the newest update of Total War Rise of Mordor version 0.5.6, and here it is. For those new to the channel, Total War Rise of Mordor is a mod for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description, a mod that is still in development and is incrementally having new material added to it. In the most recent update, apart from a variety of changes being made to several factions, changes you can see in my last video, which will also be pinned in the description, and the addition of a completely new faction, the Haradrim, link in the description too, the Easterling faction, which has been in the mod for a while, saw new units added to its roster and new visuals for pre-existing units. It's these changes we're going to be looking at, so let's get started. We're going to skip over the history of the faction because I'd just be repeating what I said in my previous video on the Easterlings, so we'll move on to the first major visible change to the faction, the visual redesign of what I consider the best general unit the Easterlings can field, the Bane of the Steppes. Compared to their previous appearance, armoured, with both the riders and the horses having a clear upgrade, being covered in armour head to toe. While most of their equipment has been changed, some things still remain relatively similar, such as their axes, which are the same, and their shields, which have the same general design, but are now far more colourful rather than dull. Each man's horse is protected by lamellar barding, rather than the previous version's leather, which completely encases the horse's neck and body front to rear, while the neck has overlaid plate barding protecting it, the lamellar having some gold pieces mixed in with the metal as a way of showing off the wealth of the riders. Finally, the horses' heads are covered in a robust faceplate, with a spike with raised sections protecting the eyes, which allow the horses to see while protecting them. Overall, the horses' barding is very much reminiscent of the armour used by cataphracts of antiquity, such as those fielded by the Parthians, Sassanids, Romans, and Byzantines, although cataphracts tended to use scale armour rather than lamellar, lamellar barding being more used by later heavy cavalry in the Middle East, like the Khwarezmians, as well as further to the east by Central Asian horsemen of the steppes, while the eye protection the horses have looks like that used by Roman and Greek cavalry. As a way of giving horses protection against enemy melee weapons and projectiles, armour such as this was excellent and more easy to produce compared to plate barding, which offered somewhat more protection. Moving away from the horses, we turn to their riders. Each man is heavily armoured, with a mail coif and standard protecting the head and neck in conjunction with fabric aventails and helmets compared to their previous appearance, with red hoods and half masks like those that the retinue of Khmul the Easterling have in the Dol Guldur faction. The helmets resemble the stereotypical Middle Eastern helmet of the Middle Ages, with its acorn shape, while these helmets have a faceplate attached, providing the face with protection and making for an intimidating look, the faceplates looking quite brutish. Faceplates were used by many cultures in the past, such as the Romans, although the cultures that I believe most inspired these particular masks are the Cumans, also known for being steppe peoples, and the masks utilised by the samurai in conjunction with their kabuto helmets. The front of the helmet is gilded with a sun pattern, both showing off the wealth of the riders as well as paying homage to one of the constants in life on the open steppe, the sun of Middle-earth. Atop their helmet are two wing-like structures shaped like flames made of gold, the attachments looking somewhat like those the Teutonic Knights are depicted having on their helmets, although such adornments, especially ones made of gold being used in battle, as opposed to being specifically ceremonial, is iffy, compared to the numerous other helmet attachments you can see in the mod. Finally, the helmets have a horsehair plume, either red or black atop them, such plumes being used by many horsemen in history such as the Cumans, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Sassanids, etc. Moving on to the rest of their armour, they wear what I'm assuming is a padded coat above which they have a mail hauberk extending to the knees, and halfway to the elbow, with a rider's split that makes sense for once, with additional lamellar overlaid over both sides of the mail, essentially operating as folds. Protecting their chest, they have the aforementioned mail, above which they have a lamellar cuirass, atop which they have a round piece of plate gilded with the symbol of a mounted archer, making for very extensive chest protection. Their upper arms are covered in lamellar pauldrons which work in conjunction with the short mail sleeves, while their forearms are covered in lamellar braces, their hands being protected by mail gloves. Lamellar armour for heavy horsemen was very commonly used throughout history, from antiquity up until a few centuries ago, so the armour is very much historical. Some notable peoples known to utilise lamellar being the Mongols and the peoples of Persia in the Middle Ages, lamellar originating from the region of Persia thousands of years before. Mail, of course, was used across Eurasia, while the round plate over the rest of the armour was also seen being used by peoples such as the Mughals and the Ottomans. Attached to their backs, each man in the unit has a red banner bearing the flaming sun symbol of the Easterlings, with attached horsetails much like the real Mongol standard. For a shield, every man uses a large round shield made of wood covered in fine red leather and rimmed in bronze with writings etched into the rims, much like the Islamic script worked into many surviving weapons and armour pieces from the Middle Ages, with flaming suns gilded onto the shields. While metal rims for shields is something I tend to be pedantic about, large round shields with rims are fairly historic, as are the leather coverings, so I'll give them a pass, although the gilded flaming sun is a bit much, given the shields are expected to see combat. Normally, I'd say shields for such heavily armoured cavalry is unhistoric. However, we know that such heavy cavalry still utilised shields, so that complaint falls flat, especially for cavalry using lamellar rather than plate. For weapons, the men wield one-handed axes on a fairly long wooden shaft, the axe tipped with an arrow-shaped back spike and a sharp spear-like tip at the top of the shaft. While axes with these additions are known, the main failing of the weapon when it comes to historical accuracy is the negative space in the axe blade and the top spike, where a triangular hole exists. And while some weapons did have portions of their metal pieces removed, such as on some halberds and partisans, it was quite rare and only really done on such large weapons, also usually being somewhat ceremonial or for elite troops such as royal bodyguards. The reason for this weapon having this feature may be the same as why the Rohirrim weapons tend to have cutouts in them, that being that Rohan is a land not rich in metals, meaning that for the most part, the most must be made of any metal available, cutting down on superfluous metal, which leads me to assume that the steppes of the east are similarly as bereft of metal. Apart from that issue, the axes look like weapons that were used very commonly by cavalrymen, particularly Persian cavalry in the 16th and 17th centuries. The unit officer, and by default general, looks identical to his men in equipment unlike his previous version, which used a sword to differentiate him, so we'll leave him and move on to the unit role. Like I said in the Easterling video, the bane of the steppes are heavy command cavalry who possess excellent armour, meaning both the riders and the horses are very resistant to enemy ranged units, as well as melee, with even spears having a tougher time bringing them down. While the unit can fight toe-to-toe with just about any heavy cavalry unit in the mod, its excellent performance is let down when it operates as shock cavalry, not being capable of launching mighty charges against enemies due to their lack of lancers, although it can pin down and destroy enemy horse easily enough. Due to its status as a command unit, only one of the Bane of the Steppes can be recruited, making them the most elite cavalry unit that the Easterlings can field, more than marking out their general status. As a general, their lack of power on the charge means that it's best to keep them back as a strategic reserve, relying on other cavalry units to do the bulk of the fighting. As a general, I consider the Bane of the Steppes the best option an Easterling general has available, given that with their heavy armour and damage in melee, they can sustain battle well and withstand concerted enemy volleys, while being capable of avoiding any spears or pikes that menace them with their speed, unlike the faction's other generals who are far more vulnerable to their respective counters. Moving on from the Bane of the Steppes, we come to another unit that's been visually changed, the Variag Warriors. This unit of shock infantry has had their armour changed massively, going from samurai-inspired helmets and bronze plate armour in a style of a mix of medieval armour and Mycenaean armour with banners attached to their backs, to a new look almost identical to that of the new Bane of the Steppes appearance, a change I very much like, with the only thing remaining vaguely the same being their two-handed axes, which now look to be made of steel rather than bronze like in their last appearance. For helmets, these men have a mix, all being conical, topped with a horsehair plume. However, their face masks are different, some having the same monstrous appearance as the masks of the Bane of the Steppes, while others look human, being almost identical to the face masks used by the warriors of the Cuman steppe peoples, very much drawing inspiration from them. Instead of a male standard and aventail to protect the neck, these warriors have a short aventail which protects the back of the skull, while the front of their neck is protected by pieces of leather, which I'm not too sure is historical, so if someone could let me know in the comments, I'd appreciate it. For body armour, they all have a padded coat over which they have steel or iron armour, much in the style of the Bane of the Steppes but less refined. Some have mail folds protecting their legs overlaid with round metal medallions, as a way of flaunting wealth, but also as adding more metal between the enemy's weapons and their bodies, while others instead use lamellar folds to protect their legs. Other warriors altogether discard leg protection and instead only have scale shirts protecting their torso, with the symbol of a sun worked into the scales, such decorations being seen in real scale shirts, with such armour being used by peoples such as the Romans. Instead of scale shirts, most warriors have lamellar cuirasses, which connect with their lamellar folds, over the top of which are round plates similar to those of the Bane of the Steppes, but also oval plates bearing the symbol of the sun rather than a mounted archer. Protecting their arms, the men have a mix of scale and lamellar pauldrons, their forearm protection ranging from lamellar vambraces to mail vambraces to scale ones too, while their hands are unprotected. Finally, protecting their shins they have lamellar greaves. Not using a shield, these men have two-handed axes that are essentially the Bane of the Steppes axe, but on a longer shaft, making a devastating weapon that would rip mail and tear padded armour apart in battle, the axes essentially serving as a cut-down halberd more than anything else, with its spear tip and rear-facing spike. The unit officer is equipped identically to his men, except that he uses a round shield identical to that of the Bane of the Steppes, while his weapon is a sabre that wouldn't look out of place in the hands of light cavalry used throughout the early modern period, such as the hussars fielded across Europe in conflicts such as the Napoleonic Wars. As a unit, these guys are your quintessential shock infantry, the only real restriction apart from their weakness to cavalry and archers being that as a Variag unit, they can only be fielded in limited numbers, meaning a massed Variag Warriors is a dead strategy, although when used normally, they're good at punching holes in enemy lines. The next unit to see a change to their appearance are the Variag Bowmen, who went from essentially being identical to the old Variag look, to now being armoured much the same as the Variag Warriors, the only real difference being their face protection. While these medium archers have the same helmets as the other Variag units, they don't have face masks, leading some of their helmets to have nasal bars attached, while others have cloth or leather veils covering the face, some choosing to leave their face bare altogether. With such an appearance, they look like the armoured archers fielded by many Middle Eastern armies during the Middle Ages, such as the archers of the Ayyubid Sultanate as well as the bowmen of the Seljuk Turks, also looking much like the heaviest Mongol archers. Because their armour is identical to the other Variag units, we'll skip it and move on to their weapons and shield. While it may seem like these men lack shields, they actually have them slung over their backs, providing back protection from enemies both in melee and also when retreating, stopping the enemy from shooting them in their backs. For melee weapons, the Variag Bowmen have an assortment of swords, most of them resembling the Ottoman Kilij sword and sabres to some degree. For ranged combat, every man uses a horn-tipped Recurve Bow, a weapon that helped make horse archers as devastating as they were, capable of being used both on foot and horseback to great effect, a weapon widely used by the peoples of the steppe, most notably the Mongols, but other horsemen such as the Cumans too, as well as the people of the Middle East once the technology reached the region. The unit officer is equipped identically to the other Variag officer, so we'll skip him and jump into the unit role. The Variag Bowmen are great troops, providing the Easterlings with better ranged power, while they're also capable of fighting on the front lines, essentially being a good melee unit that also has ranged abilities, rather than an archer being thrown into a brawl, making this unit very scary wherever capable of being used en masse, essentially allowing you to use a massive army of melee infantry that doubles as archers. However, the unit isn't the best at absorbing enemy fire in exchanges with enemy archers, while the unit is also limited in terms of how many can be fielded due to their Variag status, making a giant army of them impossible to gather, and making them most useful at bolstering your archers as well as providing your infantry with extra support once their supply of arrows have been used up. An exceptional unit with an exceptional appearance. Moving away from the Variag archers, we come to the first new unit to be added to the faction, the Khandish Sentries, the faction's only skirmisher unit. In terms of armour, these men are very much a step down from the other units we've looked at, using leather lamellar rather than metal. For helmets, they mostly use acorn-shaped nasal helms, although some have more squat helmets resembling a cerveliere, that is to say a metal skull cap, some helmets being crested while others have a mere spike. Most men in the unit have leather aventails or pieces attached to their helmets for extra protection, while most have a mix of leather or fabric veils for face protection, more so from the elements than battle if anything. For body armour, these men all wear their regular clothes over which they have leather lamellar cuirasses, with attached folds, with a round metal piece over the chest for added protection, the lamellar also being used for pauldrons and braces, with their legs left unarmoured, only wearing felt boots, a common garment among steppe peoples like the Mongols. Lamellar armour made of leather was very much used historically, notably by people such as the Japanese, whose samurai were known to use such armour in battle, leather being a cheaper alternative to metal for steppe peoples and migratory cultures due to their difficulties in establishing long-lasting production centres needed for making material to produce fabric armour such as gambesons or metal armour in large amounts. The round metal pieces most remind me of the pieces of armour used early on by warriors from Italian city-states including the Romans, essentially meaning the armour of the Khandish sentries is a fusion of Roman and steppe people styles. For shields, they use a metal buckler with a metal blazing sun adorning it, such shields being widely used in the Middle Ages, including by troops such as skirmishers who needed to be quick on the battlefield, meaning larger shields had to be discarded. For weapons, every man has a few javelins, one being held in the dominant throwing hand while the others are either in a sheath on the back or held in the warrior's other hand ready to be used immediately, something that was done by many skirmishers including ancient Greek peltasts. The javelins are short and have sharp heads, looking much like a standard javelin rather than the more derived Roman pila, being good not just for throwing but also in melee if caught out in the open, essentially being a cut-down spear. Skipping their unit officer, who's the standard Variag officer, will jump into the unit role. The Khandish sentries are currently the lightest unit that the Easterlings can deploy, given that although their faction has had an overhaul, it's nowhere near complete, with almost all of their lower tier units apart from these guys being missing. In melee, these guys can do somewhat alright against militia troops, although against more elite units or shock infantry, let alone shock cavalry, they are at a steep disadvantage. Against archers, these guys are also facing an uphill battle as their armour and shields offer them little in the way of protection against enemy volleys, while their status as skirmishers means that they're considerably outranged by archers, making the unit vulnerable to being wiped out before they can use their javelins. While javelins can do heavy damage, especially if you loose them into an enemy's open flank before charging into the mayhem with the Khandish sentries, as line of sight weapons, they're inferior to bows, which can somewhat shoot over your lines unlike skirmishers. It's because of these limitations that I have to say that this is arguably the most useless unit in the faction roster, also being incapable of being fielded in large numbers with the other archers the faction fields doing the same job as these guys, but better. A very cool looking unit and one that may be useful in the early game, but with the faction roster as it is, I can't make that call yet. Moving on from the Khandish sentries, we come to yet another unit with a visual overhaul, the Variag Lancers. Once equipped identically to the other Variag units in their old style, these guys are now equipped the same as the Variag Warriors except on horseback, meaning I'm going to skip their armour. Their horses are completely unarmoured, apart from a small round metal piece on their heads, which is more for decoration than anything, all the horses being dark in coloration, perhaps a nod to the books where it stated that Sauron has a preference for his servants riding dark horses. Using the same round shields as the Bane of the Steppes, their weapon is instead a lance with a horsehair tuft near the point, much like the spears and lances utilised by the Mongols and Chinese. The unit officer is outfitted the same as his subordinates, the only major difference being his sabre, so we'll move on from him to the unit's role. As heavy shock cavalry, these guys are the striking power of the Easterlings, capable of going head to head with other cavalry, although the unit is vulnerable to spears and pikes like all cavalry, although this weakness is exacerbated by their lack of horse armour, which makes the unit very vulnerable to archers. This unit does well at smashing into enemy formations who have engaged with the Easterling heavy infantry. However, because they are limited in number as a result of being a Variag unit, hordes of heavy horse aren't really viable, and are more easily pulled off by the Rohirrim. Moving on from the Variag Lancers, we come to the next new unit to be added to the faction, the Khandish Horse Archers. These mounted archers aren't very well armoured, having a mix of skull caps and nasal helms for head protection, with leather pieces and veils attached, while for body armour they have padded coats, some having padded pauldrons in addition to the coats, lacking all other armour except for leather braces. While the braces are fine and make sense for mounted archers, the padded coats seem to be studded with metal, something that is ahistorical, with the armour being perfect if not for the studs, which are a creation of fiction more than anything. Horse archers are known for being lightly equipped given speed and manoeuvrability are their greatest asset, so padded armour and even regular clothing was commonly used by mounted archers, such as the legendary Mongol horsemen who wore very similar outfits. For a shield, every man has a metal buckler slung over his back, providing him with protection when running away from approaching enemies, potentially blocking enemy pot shots, although the shields won't do much to volley fire. For weapons, they use the Recurve Bow, practically engineered to be as deadly as possible on horseback over the centuries, perfect at raining down death and destruction on slow-moving enemy infantry and horsemen incapable of catching up with this fast unit. The unit officer is a standard Variag officer but on horseback, so we'll move on to the unit role. These guys are obviously mounted archers, capable of weakening enemy formations through concerted fire while avoiding engaging the enemy in melee due to their speed, also being somewhat capable of being used as melee cavalry to charge enemy ranks once they've used up their ammunition, although they do far less damage than other cavalry units when used as such. While such a unit is useful, the Khandish horse archers have many limitations that make it impossible for the Easterlings to field mass armies of them, the unit being limited for starters, meaning only a few can be added to an army to enhance its strength rather than be its core, while also being highly vulnerable to spearmen as well as melee cavalry. Likewise, because the unit has a shorter range compared to infantry archers, such troops have to be driven off before these guys are deployed due to their weakness to enemy ranged units. Overall, while they give the Easterlings mobile archers to harass enemies with, the faction that is most suited to hit and run tactics with light horse are the Haradrim, the Easterlings being more suited to direct battle. Moving on from the Khandish horse archers, we come to the last major change to the faction and their newest unit, which is also a potential choice for general, the Wain Rider Chiefs. This unique chariot unit is gorgeously equipped for both the chariots and the charioteers, their armour in fact being practically identical to the previous look of the Variag units, suggesting that as a way of showing the difference between the disparate Easterling clans, the Wain Riders have been assigned this look, while the Variags have been given a more human appearance, with lamellar armour being used chiefly. Looking at the chariot first and the horses pulling them, each chariot has a team of 2 horses, both being mostly unarmoured, although their heads are protected by golden etched faceplates, with their chest having a similar decorated band surrounding the torso, with a golden rondel being placed in the centre. The horses are hitched to a chariot with a main shaft with a curved blade attached to the end for ramming into enemy formations. The chariots themselves are one-man affairs, having a main frame covered in leather and gilded dragons, while the spoked wheels have curved blades extending from them, making the chariots perfect at cutting through enemies and lopping off limbs and halving bodies. Chariots were very much used in warfare in antiquity, by peoples such as the Egyptians, the Assyrians and the Persians, being their equivalent to tanks. However, as horses became larger and capable of being ridden, chariots were phased out of service, only really being used by the Celtic tribes, by which point they were antiquated technology, being outmatched by cavalry who were faster and more manoeuvrable, as well as less resource intensive in regards to horses, multiple generally being needed for a chariot. While one-man chariots are known, normally they'd have multiple crew members to make them more deadly, having a driver, a spearman and an archer, while some tended just to have archers, being more lighter vehicles akin to mounted archers, with blades on the wheels being a common and deadly sight. Looking at the charioteer, they wear red garments over which they wear bronze or gilded plate armour, having a cuirass to protect the chest, while their legs are protected by folds in the same style as the plate greaves, the arms having plate pauldrons and spolders as well as vambraces. For a helmet, the warriors have a very much Japanese-inspired kabuto helmet, with shikori neck guards attached to the helmet, which is a composite of bronze and leather. Finally, attached to the charioteer's back is a banner bearing the symbol of the Golden Dragon, an Easterling emblem. The unit officer doesn't appear to look any different from his men, so we'll skip him and look at the unit role. On the battlefield, these guys are veritable tanks, capable of ploughing into caught-out formations and tearing them apart, being very useful at running down light infantry such as skirmishers and archers, while when charging into enemy rears they can annihilate units in the blink of an eye. While they're exceptionally devastating, the unit does have many drawbacks such as its small unit number, which means it can be overwhelmed quickly, its weakness to spearmen and pikes as well as archers, and its relatively low speed and manoeuvrability, meaning enemy cavalry can very quickly pin down the unit and destroy them. Due to their elite status, the units are limited in number. However, I believe this is for the best, as it means you can use them as a surprise flanking force, the enemy not expecting them to be deployed due to their many weaknesses. As I said before, this is also a contender for general, and while it certainly has the raw destructive power a general unit should have, and can punch holes in enemy lines and turn the tide of battle when deployed properly, due to their colossal bonus on the charge, I still feel that the Bane of the Steppe makes for a more rounded general, not being quite as destructive but being faster and more manoeuvrable, allowing for the unit to avoid enemy threats, something the Wain Rider Chiefs are very hard pressed to do. A cool unit to be sure, but not one that's necessarily needed when playing as the Easterlings. Looking at the faction as a whole, now that their roster has been revamped, the Easterlings' limited focus on quality melee infantry has been broadened, the infantry strength of the faction still shining through. However, now the Easterlings can deploy far more ranged units and cavalry to help bolster their infantry, somewhat being an evil version of the Gondorians with their focus on good quality infantry. Up until the next update for Rise of Mordor drops, I'm probably going to be making videos on other games, but there are some other Rise of Mordor videos planned for the future. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. This is your host Jakov, signing out.